Thank you, Mirik. That was awesome. Great way to go into the discussion now. And two things I just want to let everyone know because they might not be privy to. And I've just found out a couple of them recently. Is number one, right now, Vancouver's doing a Music City study, looking at how Vancouver is a music city. And in that discussion, obviously, all the topics in the scene we're talking about is very much part and parcel to that. So number one is that, and number two is that the City Council is currently meeting and talking about the conceptual framework of having a night mayor for Vancouver. So when you look at having, this kind of synergy, coming together at the same time, the opportunity right now is probably the best it's ever been for us to really move forward with something like this. So from the questions to the audience, the discussion to the day, I think the framework is really about, okay, how do we do this? Why is this important? Etc. So without further ado, I'd like to let each of our esteemed panelists introduce themselves, starting with Loren and then through Dan, Rose, and Stacey.
Hello, my name is Loren. I am co-founder of a nightlife community in Los Angeles called Rhonda International. We focus on diversity on the dance floor, truth in house music, and polysexual hard partying. And we, I guess the reason why I'm here, being from LA, is because I have made a lot of trips both to Amsterdam and to Vancouver. And when I first kind of went to Amsterdam to see and witness firsthand as a fan of music and a fan of the club culture, what Amsterdam was kind of, how the scene was just glowing hot, amazing, and very inspirational. It was kind of like, being a Soviet villager going to an American supermarket and just being like, oh my God, there's all this food here. And then you kind of wonder why, and it makes you question your ideology. And so in seeing this and seeing, there was this really famous club, Trouw, which has since closed, in Amsterdam, and seeing a club that could go all night with a bunch of happy people all getting along together, with a beautiful gourmet restaurant in the back of it, with multi-use space, with artists in residence there, and there's studio spaces for artists. I was wondering why that was, and I was fortunate to meet Mirik, and I found out that, it wasn't some fluke, or it wasn't because the people in Amsterdam are cooler, and they are cool, but it's because of active measures being taken by people like him, being taken by the city government. It's because of unification happening within the nightlife community. And as somebody from Los Angeles, who, we are very similar to you guys. We're situated in between the mountains and the water. There's not enough space. It's really expensive to live here and there. We have the same challenges, and we have equally draconian nightlife laws. We can't serve alcohol past 2 a.m. All clubs pretty much have to close at 2 a.m. in LA. And, for the cultures here and in LA to still be, thriving the way they are, it's a testament to there's initiative here in this community. So I think that we can all be inspired to take that initiative and funnel it into something positive. And I think that was way too long for an intro, so I'm sorry.
Yeah. So my name is Rose Carrico. I'm a director at Redgate Art Society. For people that don't know, our primary mandate is to provide as affordable as possible studio space for artists and musicians, but we also have common space where we can have events. Basically, our focus is on the grassroots layer because we really believe that without that happening in a city, you can't have any of the other levels of culture. And unfortunately, that is the area that's becoming more and more difficult to support in this city. We are in the process of getting evicted from one of our buildings, and the problems that we're facing are very universal, so I think I'm on this panel just to discuss those.
Absolutely, we'll get into those very quickly.
Oh yes, we will. I have so many opinions, you guys.
And Stacey?
Yeah, my name is Stacey Forrester. I'm I'm one of the co-founders of a project called Good Night Out in Town. I am also the harm reduction manager for a little West Coast festival called Base Coast. So Good Night Out is an international campaign. We are the first chapter outside of the UK that really focuses on making nightlife more accessible and safer for anyone who's not a straight white dude. No offense to all of you. So really, I come at this, my background is in nursing. I come at this as a public health issue. I believe that if all members of a community can access whatever music, cultural scene they want to, it's actually a public health issue. And so what Good Night Out does in town, we have a few different ways we do this, but we basically have a training program that works with any venue, any liquor license of any capacity, liquor primary, food primary, temporary permit, to be able to identify just a new lens to how you look at your space, help you identify what's called risks for perpetuation. So what's happening here that maybe allows sexual misconduct or other harassment to happen. And it really comes from a place of both Ashton and I really grew up in the more underground scene, and we're kind of used to nights where every beautiful weirdo can have a good night and be however they want to be. And realizing that the mainstream deserves to have that feeling too. No matter what scene you participate in, you deserve to feel good when you're out and when you go home. And so that's kind of where we come from.
Okay, thank you. So my first question deals with spaces. We're going to start there, and then we're going to go from spaces into solutions tonight. So the reality is that Vancouver is in this interesting situation, and I also have a place in New York and am able to see kind of what's happened there in the same way as what's happened in Amsterdam or Berlin or a lot of other cities. LA is a great example, San Francisco, etc. around the world, where we're dealing with a scarcity of space, period. And not only a scarcity of space in terms of space one can acquire, but the cost here is fairly bananas vis-a-vis the reality on the ground. And everyone already knows that, and that kind of affects everyone, from non-profit spaces to for-profit clubs to everyone in the middle, tech companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everyone's affected by these things in a very real way. So starting with Anna Rose, I just would love to hear a bit about the context of, what is it like trying to operate a space right now? And, it's so brave to do it right now. It's so... having started open studios, Deep Blue, and some of these other spaces over the years, and finding spaces for new forms throughout the many years, it's it's not really the easiest thing to do in the world. It's an art form in itself, so to speak. So I wonder if, just to contextualize the conversation here, and why the idea of having something like a nightmare is so important in that context.
I mean, I think it's interesting that you brought up a scarcity of spaces, because I actually don't think that the problem is scarcity of spaces. There's a lot of space in Vancouver. It's just ridiculously expensive. So I think that there's... Sorry, what was the question?
You're answering it. The state of the spaces.
The state of the
and
spaces.
Say what you see.
Sure.
And then, we can talk a bit about how there can be solutions around.
Right. So we all know that the real estate market in Vancouver is, as you put it, bananas. And I think what a lot of people aren't thinking about is that has sort of shifted over to the commercial sector. The province and the city have tried to put measures in place in order to alleviate the burdens on residential housing, which is obviously a priority. People need housing first. But we're arguing that people need culture almost as much, maybe just as much, and that there hasn't been as much thought put into how we're going to alleviate that burden for the arts.
And it's also really difficult to get the licenses for it.
That is another hurdle, absolutely. The licensing, the zoning laws as well are very difficult for us. For instance, our organization, we have a very multi-use space. But according to zoning laws, technically we can't have an art gallery at our space because that's retail and we're zoned for light industrial, which is what, yes, it is hilarious. So essentially the city has a lot of trouble, I think, putting us in the containers that already exist. And so they just haven't tried. So I think that would be one way to really, really help out artist spaces in Vancouver.
That's a really good point, and I think to that point, permits and licenses in any city need to evolve and change.
Absolutely.
The last 20 years, the last 30 years, the entire world has changed how we do everything, based on technology, becoming a global society and everything else. And with that, there's a number of incredible challenges. So my question to Mirik is, in Amsterdam, how did you guys figure this out to start? How did you guys start to say, okay, here's how we have spaces, this is where we can do it, how do we create, how did the genesis of that come to be?
I think it all starts with the vision from the cultural department. They create a vision for creative industry, they create a vision for culture. And if there is decided that you need to have this non-for-profit spaces, which I like the art factories, what we have, that when it's in that vision, because nothing will change when people can't vote for it. And I think this is the place where these decisions are being made, and this is why it's so good to get self-organized and be a voice on that table. And you guys are probably a voice already on the table, or try to shape that discussion. I think it's really about trying to shape the discussion of the policymakers and the decision makers with the information you gained over the years by running these spaces.
And what did they do? What was the motion that happened? Did they change how? Talk about how the permitting changed, how the thinking around it changed.
So I think the city of Amsterdam acknowledged the fact that a place like Trouw, where Loren was referring to, that is so important that if it would leave, or if it would just close because they had a temporary license, that if it would close, that it won't pop up somewhere else automatically. You need to have the right policy in place to also support these spaces to be created. And the Trouw, which was a former pressing or a newspaper pressing facility, then went to an old school building at the other side of town.
The school.
Yeah, the school. And it's also temporarily, so it's also 5-6 years, but it doesn't really matter that it's temporarily. You just need to have the right policy in place that when it closes, something like this opens up somewhere else. And that is something, an acknowledgement the city of Amsterdam has, and I'm really happy about it. But we should not politicalize too much these decisions, because nightlife policy are for the long term and for the citizens.
And I'm happy to say the head of cultural spaces is here tonight. She's a very open-minded person, and so I'm excited for her to be here and listening and everything else. That's a really interesting point. We have a number of spaces in the city. Redgate would be one of them. Val, Open Studios, a number of others that are basically small iterations of what the foundational.
That's what makes the city unique.
Absolutely, and I think that's really sensical, really interesting. So then the next question, which kind of comes out of that, is I wanted to talk about the importance of being able to actually have clubs stay open later, and actually how much safer that is. And Stacey, I wanted you to kind of talk about your experience in some of the festivals that are able to go a little later due to the context of the festivals, whether it be a Base Coast or in new forms, and what you might see, say, on Granville, and this kind of wild myriad of places that you're able to go about, and the importance of how much safer our entire club scene, our entire nightlife would be if there were initiatives to go later in the city.
Question. So I think one of the major differences, thank you, with festivals is that harm reduction and safer space policies are very integral to their operation. Most festivals have really dialed in the idea of, we have people all weekend with music until 4 or 5 a.m. And so they do kind of prioritize the conversation about your phone's okay? About safety, harm reduction, safer space measures, strategies to deal with the reality that there's going to be people using drugs and alcohol. And so I do think that the nightlife industry has a lot to learn from those. You may only be in a club for 4, 5, 6 hours as opposed to 10 hours of music at a festival. But there are still things that you can take. I don't know which one's thinking about. There are still things you can take from that translate to nightlife. So creating policy around sort of sexual misconduct, bringing in outside harm reduction agencies, those things can be scaled down to nightlife. But I think that the nightlife industry hasn't really loosened up their laws around having that conversation inside. So in terms of staying up late or staying open later, I think that there's so much that needs to change about kind of mainstream club culture, and that I think that is a viable solution, but it would really require all of these other conversations to happen around safety.
Right, so something I've seen in somewhere like Amsterdam is in any of the clubs that Mirik was talking about that go till 6 or 8 in the morning, or 24 hours in some cases, there's really clear rules about the boundaries and what you can and cannot do, and there's security all over the place, and if you're out of line, you're out of there, and that creates a way safer environment than rumbling out in the street at 3 a.m. going somewhere like who knows what, right? Because that's when you get a slippery slope. You don't have any of that conscious decision making like that you guys do or anyone else. And so I think the integration of having later hours with rules around safer space is incredibly important.
And I think that, right now it makes a lot of sense because there's no transit at night. So why we should just keep the clubs open until the SkyTrain starts anyway, because right now you can't get home.
But you also did this pilot project just now, right? And it was also it had a super positive effect, you told me.
Yeah. So we, in the fall, we ran a street team in the GED, having bystanders out from midnight to 3 a.m. in that public realm. So they weren't in the venues, they were wandering the streets. They've kind of been dubbed the Red Cross for drunk people. So they're this very
which is also good.
Yeah. They're very pink. They're very friendly. They have these backpacks full of harm reduction supplies, but also full of water and candy and juice, and just engaging in the public realm. And one of the reasons we feel that is so successful is that because that club district in particular is very masculine, and so that street team very intentionally interrupts that masculinity in the public realm, almost like this pink shield kind of pinging it away and off into space. And it made a really significant impact in the culture down there, just by having a presence on the street.
That's great. So my next question is about diversity. So I think a problem that a lot of cities have is often a problem with having real diversity. Mirik, we were talking about this before. Loren, Anna Rose, we kind of discussed it. And so as you're putting together kind of the larger inclusivity knowledge base, ways of intention around it, etc. Why is diversity so important, and what are some different methodologies that you can take from your lessons in Amsterdam, Mirik, and then I'd love to hear from everyone else around that too.
I think Amsterdam is pretty behind that diversity issue. I think we create definitely safe spaces for our LGBT community, but from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, I think we can really do a lot more. I personally believe that a culturally diverse nightlife will lead to a more social and ethnic inclusive city.
Amen.
I'm 100% convinced of that. And I think we need to educate and have social spaces where people kids from 16 to 18 to 20-year-olds can hang together and connect with a diverse group of citizens of the city where you live in. Because when you're 16, then you develop your vision for who you are the rest of your life. 16 to 18, and there's a lot of underage drinking around 16 because people start to grow up when they're 16, not when they're 21. I don't know what the liquor law is here in actually 19. Okay, that's at least a bit more decent, but this is the moment between 16 and 20 or 16 and 19. That's the moment where social spaces where people can safely go to will make sure that they're more open-minded and more focused on a diverse and inclusive city.
I think it would be important to remember the importance of nightlife as almost the vanguard of any inclusive society. You have to remember that the gay rights movement was essentially started outside of a gay bar when a drag queen threw a beer bottle at a police officer who was harassing them. Turned into 30, 40 years later what we have now, which is they changed the world essentially. A lot of times before that, nightlife spaces were often the only places in a lot of cities that were integrated. And it's important to realize and value and know the value of how nightlife can change that of the city. So if a city is serious about trying to be inclusive, and if a city is serious about being representative of its citizens, a city should value what the role that nightlife plays in that, which is paramount, I would say.
And Rose?
All right. So first of all, I really like what you brought up about that age thing, because I feel like I would be remiss in this conversation if I didn't mention the just tragic situation of all ages venues in Vancouver right now. I feel like that's something that we really need to work on as a creative community, and I don't think you can have diversity of everything else without including young people in that conversation. As far as diversity for venues or representation, I think in our experience, what's worked the best for us just personally as an organization is making sure that you have adequate representation within the organization, because people are going to bring those agendas is the wrong word, but essentially those conversations to the table, as well as diversity of programming. If you have all post-punk shows, you're going to get a lot of white dudes, right? So just keeping in mind that we're providing entertainment, but we want to provide entertainment for everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think I would echo everything here. I would say that, obviously there are some amazing BIPOC powerhouses in the city, and they're not up here. So really when we talk about diversity, it's again ironic that panels don't reflect that. And I think it's disappointing that, and this isn't unique to Vancouver, but the nightlife industry was really built on the backs of people of color and the queer community, and exploits from them for entertainment, but does an egregious job of creating space actually where they are legitimately safe. And I don't offer a solution, but I think that, it's awful.
Okay, so moving into kind of the way forward. So when you started, Mirik, the sort of the nonprofit society, which you were talking about a bit earlier, but how did you actually do it, and who was involved in that? Who was the group? You say you have this advisory group during the year. How did that happen? How does that happen?
What helped me a lot was, and I always I promised myself that I would, in every talk, at least drop his name once. Last year, in October 2017, the former mayor, or the mayor of Amsterdam, he passed away. He was a heavy smoker, and he understood, but also he understood nightlife. I worked with him for 5 years closely together. And I also mentioned before that I really need to have, if you want to influence decision making when it comes to nightlife, you need to have the top down and bottom up structure in place. I worked really closely with the mayor for 5 years, so you need to have this opportunity of people that want to work with you. And what we did, I asked the mayor to organize a fundraiser, simply. I asked him to organize a fundraiser. We brought together 20 people of the Amsterdam nightlife scene, the bigger and influential players, and they all put some money on the table to take me to the first year. And the mayor of Amsterdam doubled that money. So not doubled, equaled.
Matched it.
Matched it. Sorry. Top down, bottom up structure in place, and also for maybe like bigger operators or influential operators, also just put some money on the table, so you can really start this movement.
And who was like in the advisory group? Like it was like clubs, festivals, nonprofits. Like it was a whole diverse group that made this up.
Yeah, it's a whole diverse group. I also echo what you're saying. Of course, there's always that discussion of talking about diversity but not being diverse yourself. This is a topic. Change will come from awareness and acknowledgement. Hearing about the diversity topic once doesn't mean you really understand or acknowledge what it really means. And for us, it was really important to reach out to all the communities. But like, you also have to be honest that like, I sometimes see also operators or nightlife operators as servers. They want to ride their own wave and they don't want to be bothered because they're busy doing their business in their club or in their bar or creative space. But it's really about coming together and giving everybody a voice on the table, and also giving everybody a voice on the table. But also, if sometimes people don't really feel what you're doing as a movement or the group that you brought together, that you just say, okay, if you not want to join us now, know that the door is always open when on a later moment you want to join this movement that wants to empower, wants to get empowered and influence decision making. So always keep the door open to everybody. Sorry for this super long answer.
No, it's good. It kind of works into a follow-up question that I actually had for Loren. Is like, so you guys are starting to work on this in LA right now.
Yeah, so we're probably, in terms of like year zero of going on this journey, we're like 6 months ahead of you guys, where year zero is when Mirik comes and talks to people. So, I was one of the people that helped bring him out to the city, and immediately from there, and as I'm sure you'll see right after this, you're going to get people coming up talking, and connections will form, de facto committees will form, initiative will start to coalesce. So I think that there's two things to keep in mind as you embark on this important mission. Number one is that what makes nightlife beautiful, the diversity of it, is also what makes it so hard to manage. And when you're going to bring a lot of different people and different communities and big egos and a lot of things together, it's not going to be easy. But I think that it's important to just plug away and keep going. It's not always going to be pretty, it's not going to be easy, but just keep going. The other thing to keep in mind is one of the things that we've encountered as we've been on this mission is that the immediately what you'll see is that the big money kind of comes into this, and as a city's licensing might open up, it means big dollars for certain people, and you will have certain big money people in the room trying to push things around in a certain way. I think that this community right here in this room is probably more focused on the underground and the real culture and what really makes a nightlife culture beautiful. Keep going in that direction, and it may involve working in parallel with the people with money doing their thing, but just keep going in that direction. There was another point I had. Oh, the other point I had was that it's important to, as you embark on this journey, to kind of start reframing the narrative. I think it's a big problem with talking about nightlife is the demonization of it. As he mentioned, as soon as something, a stabbing happens in front of a club and they talk about shutting down all the clubs. A stabbing happens in like a baseball stadium parking lot, and they're not going to stop baseball games. No. And so there's a demonization factor going. So I think it would help. It helps to kind of talk about, start being proud of what we do here in nightlife. Start being proud of the social change and what we're about, and start reframing this as an economic boon to the city, as a cultural boon to the city. When Berlin, with its techno, is selling more hotel rooms than Rome and its 2,000 years of Roman history.
Yeah.
You know, I think that it's like
that's a really nice fact. That 30% of all the visitors go to Berlin for the underground scene.
Yeah.
And I think the city earned something like 200 million a year. This is also my friend Lutz from Berlin, from Club Commission doing. The city earned 200 million on city tax a year. 30% of the people were coming for nightlife. So they said to the city marketing organization, well, better you give us then 30% of the 200 million, because that is what we represent.
Yeah.
It was not like that amount, but they got a
Right.
serious portion.
You got something.
Yeah,
and I think and to your point, I think I've heard this a lot here, and you see it a lot in cities like Berlin. A lot of the companies that are more into hiring this the younger generation come to cities like Berlin to set up. Berlin's, I think, the third biggest tech center in the world now, after New York and after New York and Silicon Valley. I think it's like maybe tied with LA or something, and it's a lot of it is attributed to because there's culture there. People want to work somewhere
And
where there's culture. space, but less and less all the time. Okay, we're right on time, so I want to offer questions up to the audience at this point. This is being recorded and streamed, so I think we'll have to. Thank you, Loren. If we can have someone maybe who can pass the microphone, if you want to just raise your hand if you have a question, and then we can.
And say who you are, what you.
No questions.
There we go.
Rob Calder.
I'll take the plunge. My name is Rob Calder. My company is actually the center of the Music City Study. We got funding from our friends here at Creative BC and Factor nationally. So we started an advisory council. Anyway, if you have any questions about that, you can talk to myself or Lynn Ross over there from the city. My question actually has to do with what you commented earlier about these spaces that actually were on the peripheral of the city versus the inside of the city. Kind of feel like Vancouver has a very pretentious attitude about needing to be like in the core or something. I think it's over, to be honest with you. I think my personal opinion.
Yes, me too.
Maybe not entirely over, but I think we really do have to look to other regions, other areas. City of Vancouver can still play a really lead role, but to be open to Richmond and Burnaby and Surrey and the core New West. I just wanted to ask you how that development worked in Amsterdam and any lessons learned.
Amsterdam has the population of Amsterdam is 850,000 people, and we attract 17 million tourists on a yearly basis. So the city center of Amsterdam is already super crowded and popular, and we could only make the argument with the mayor, but also with city council, that having nightclubs in the outskirts of the city is a good way to spread out people over the city. Definitely in the school or Trouw, 50% of the people were probably foreigners. No, not even. No, maybe something like this. Were foreign people, and I think the people that you attract who go to these venues, they're also more likely not to also hang out in the city center. Go to the Madame Tussauds. I don't know if you have this. Go to the Madame Tussauds and hang out probably in a record store or go somewhere else. So they're not the ones that causing the problems, but spreading out the people is really important. And also because of these licenses now, at first people didn't want to cycle more than 10 minutes, and now with the school and the Trouw, we brought it up to 25 minutes. So it's also then Amsterdam is really small. Of course, but really spreading people out over the city, leaving the center. In my opinion, people always think when they have to change last call policy, they have to change it for the whole city. But that is not that's not what I stand by. It doesn't matter that certain areas of the city have a different closing time. It makes it more diverse. Of course, I understand that certain operators will then say, okay, this is false competition, but being 25 minutes or half an hour outside of the city center is also creates a barrier. So having small pockets with different closing hours, I think that makes the city more diverse, and then we will spread out to people that want to go to their own place that has their own DNA.
That's great. Anna?
Sorry, I'd also like to just speak to that, because I really think while that is a possibility, the first step is changing the transit system. Just because I feel like Vancouver just doesn't have.
What are small steps you can change in this transit system?
Absolutely.
Because are there also
just don't
small
think it's
parts? Because
feasible.
otherwise, like it's suddenly so big, you know. And then, what are small parts that you can change?
So we have the SkyTrain. I don't know why the SkyTrain doesn't run later than it does. Right, currently I think on the weekends, it stops running at 1:30.
It's crazy.
The clubs close
Would
at
everybody
3.
would everybody use it here in the room?
Yes, absolutely. So,
Small steps.
interesting anecdote about that. The city of Vancouver has recommended to TransLink, it's a different organization that runs the SkyTrain, to stay open later. And they're like, well, we're not going to right now. And they don't have any real reason, and the city of Vancouver has put all these exact reasons on the table. So it's like, if you think about it, this small step, like they don't have to do anything but keep it open later. If it ran till 4 or 5, shut down for, an hour, and then it's open again at 6, it would literally change the city by doing, it's automated.
Yeah.
Like, they don't even have anything they have to do.
And if government would be, in London now, the tube runs 24/7.
Yeah.
And it was a huge increase of revenue for, of course, Vancouver's not London, okay, but still, really often these decisions are made on, the emotions. It will not bring up a lot of money, or it will create an unsafe situation. And that is also probably what a good night out could help, saying, okay, with the SkyTrain, it's not a bunch of drunk people, it's also people that want to go home, people that probably work in the hospital or wherever. Mobility also always leads to more safety.
Absolutely.
I think that goes along with kind of reframing the narrative, because how are you, once you go, I think it would behoove people to talk to TransLink in a way that they might understand, and find out why TransLink isn't, game for this sort of thing. And maybe this is when it's important to reframe the narrative into, some people only talk dollars and cents, and start reframing, that's when gathering data is important on the economic impact of having a more robust nightlife to neighborhoods. Those are the kinds of arguments that you can take to people who aren't tuned into this. You could take it to those kinds of, civic operators or, municipalities to talk about these things.
Absolutely. And I think to that point, the one time where permits open up, licenses open up, the SkyTrain runs all the time, runs when things like the Olympics come here. When there's a big event, everything all of a sudden becomes like an international city, because we have to look like an international city for a few years. So it's like, all we have to do is just think like an international city all the time.
But actually, that's the same thing in Amsterdam. But it proves it actually works.
Right.
It proves it works, and it can be safe, and it's fine,
Right. I mean, Amsterdam is like a sister city in this way, where you have this kind of weird, risk-averse thing, and then all of a sudden they make a decision, and it makes so much sense. But it always has to do with how will the rest of the world think about us? So if we always think about that every day is like some actual interesting special occasion, right away. Other questions from the audience? Okay, great. Now we've got lots of questions.
My name's Emily Vance. I am a journalism student, and I'm in the beginning stages of working on a documentary that speaks to a lot of this, mainly shrinking space and affordability in the Vancouver arts scene. I had a question for Loren. I was wondering if you could speak to, you said LA was similar to Vancouver in that regard. How has the city and its residents been dealing with this shrinking space and shrinking affordability?
I mean, it's not easy. You're going to essentially be, standing. It's like the arts versus the forces of capitalism. It's not very easy. I will say that, spaces like the Arts District in the downtown was basically started when, this is what Mirik was talking. Mirik often talks about city planning at night, and there's small changes that a city can make that make a long-term impact for the city. So one of the things that our city did 20 years ago was a lot of the unused industrial space that was kind of laying derelict downtown. They changed the zoning laws to allow these spaces to have artists in residence and studio spaces and those kinds of things. It ended up being a small little change that didn't affect anybody at the time, at least people with money didn't affect them at the time. Now Arts District is, some of the most hottest real estate in the city, and it's pricing out all the artists. And you kind of see this play out all the time in various cities. Nightlife and the creative communities are the people that come in and bring value to a neighborhood, and then they're the first people to be pushed out once that value is realized by the stakeholders. So, it's a difficult thing that we're dealing with, and we're dealing with it in the same way that you guys are dealing with it. I think that what it's going to take is, showing the city the value that you bring as the creative community. And if you can't speak to them in their language and show them, you can't just say, hey, this place is fun for me, I think it should be here. You should show them why it's important for their city. Those people aren't ever going to set foot into spaces like hers, but they need to understand why that's important. So it's really frustrating, and you have to understand that what Mirik said is that every time one of those little creative sparks, those little pieces of real estate that are important for a community go away, they're not going to come back. So if you think about places like, New York, which was for me and my party, it was New York in the 70s was the inspiration, where there was clubs like the Gallery and Studio 54 and Paradise Garage. In New York, 1977 is where hip hop, disco, and punk all got started at the same time. Nowadays, they chose to go the route of having it be for a city of commerce instead of being a city of culture, and that kind of explosion of culture will never happen in that city again. So be careful with how you proceed right now, because it's going to dictate how your city's going to look in 30, 40 years.
Next question. Go here, and then let's go over to them. Okay, you got that.
Hi, my name's Catherine. Back in the late 70s, I used to go dancing in Vancouver to a place called Faces, and they had something called a tea dance, and it was the best place to go dancing because it started at 4 on a Saturday, and people 4 in the afternoon. I know. And it was a regular dance club. They played a range of music so that people could dance to the music they would enjoy at their own clubs. And then after a certain period, people would go and eat, and then they'd go off to their various clubs. And then it closed, and I don't think there's been anything like that ever since. And I don't understand why, because I work. I cannot afford to go out and get home at 4 in the morning and then get up the next day. And so I think there's a really big market waiting for earlier hours, not just the later hours.
I agree completely. Definitely. Erica?
Hey guys. So I'm Erica Lapidot Jensen. I've been doing art events and art parties and a bunch of stuff for quite a while. Most recently, Gift Fest 3000, and just recently opening the Kennel. So one thing that is really important that I think that we need to touch on a little bit is how to deal with people that are abusive or problematic in the underground scene, because especially with the Me Too movement that happened earlier in the fall, there was quite a bit of turmoil over that, and I just want to talk about how we can deal with that in a positive and productive way without shooting ourselves in the foot. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Stacey, you want to start, and then
Okay, so I think that obviously harassment in nightlife is not anything new, and it's not anything that's unique to Vancouver. Recognizing that the Me Too movement has been around for a long time, originally, starting in communities of color, and then resurfacing here now and rocking pretty much the entertainment industry, the music industry, everywhere, including Vancouver. So this is why this conversation is so important, because I think that people have been saying they've been harmed by people for a long time, and for a long time people haven't been listening. I think that a lot of The behaviors that that are now brought to light have been normalized in the nightlife industry for a long time. They've been considered a normal part of going out. I think that we as a society celebrate people in a way that allows us to ignore their abuse, whether they're in a band or a DJ or whatever it is. And we're in this really moment of reckoning around that. And it's time to implement, just like spaces have to submit a policy or a plan for sanitation or a plan to get people out when there's a fire, they need to have to submit a plan for more vulnerable patrons. And spaces need to be accountable for the behaviors that happen in them. Clubs and venues don't exist in a cultural vacuum. So all of the oppressions that exist outside, we like to think that spaces are sanctuaries from those oppressions, but the reality is they're actually not. So the first step is acknowledging it. The second step is opening the door to conversation. I think that the conversation of like banning people and watch lists and all of those things is a whole other panel that we can get into, but I think it's time that the nightlife industry can no longer ignore this. I know that you're really trying to, but you can't anymore. It's here and it's in front of you, and there are solutions. You just have to be ready to listen to the people that have them.
Yeah, I want to tell an interesting anecdote that then Mirik will talk right after, because it will go to Mirik. So when everything started in Vancouver, I was actually on a plane to Amsterdam for ADE. And all of a sudden, I land in Amsterdam, or actually in Barcelona on my way, and Facebook's flooded, and I'm like, what? And people are messaging me, all these things are going on, and I was like, a month before all this had happened, we had a number of panels on New Forms around, this exact discussion, and New Forms has worked with Stacey for years, etc. And so, it's more than top of mind, it's visceral, it's going through my body, I'm crying, I'm like, this is just something else. And it's here, and it's not going anywhere. And so I'm at all the different clubs in Amsterdam. And at every single one of those clubs, there were very clear rules telling patrons, like at Hate or something, or like at Hate, the rules, or like when you go to like digital, any of the spaces, there's these big rules on the walls, about everything from consuming drugs to how you treat anyone in the space, equality, inclusivity, and if you go out of line from that, it's like a no-go zone. And I was like, oh, right. And then a good friend of mine who met me in Amsterdam and was coming from Berlin at the time, he said, the problem is that the spaces in somewhere like Vancouver, they're not open like this. They're not open late. They're not running like this. So how do you not, you have to have this context to operate these things in this way. So to pass it over to Mirik, I'd really like to hear from you on this, but I think it was amazing because obviously this had come out of a lot of the discussions that, the Nightmare panel had done.
And I'm going to interrupt before I pass it over. I think that we are seeing more of those posters, whether they're Good Night Out posters or they're an internal poster. However, to be a bit antagonistic here, it's just a fucking poster. It doesn't mean anything if you say zero tolerance for harassment, but then I go to your bouncer with a complaint and they're like, well, I saw you taking drinks from him all night. Or they say so the poster is the first step, but like was included in your presentation, there has to be the capacity to follow up on it. So there has to be a system to track. Venues need to, for their own sort of identifying their gaps, they have to, every complaint they get about harassment or homophobia or whatever it is has to be tracked so that once a month they can be like, okay, you know what's happening here on Saturday nights, because we see a real spike in complaints. What's going on? Who's on the door? Etc. Etc. So posters are great, and I'm glad that venues are starting to be like, you know what? This is a space where this isn't okay, but there needs to be the capacity to move forward with everything else that comes around those posters. Yeah.
So I fully agree with you. we also thought about this. What I wanted to ask you actually, you behind the computer. What I wanted to ask you actually is, do you think do you think that it would work? Maybe you answered it answered it already a bit, but do you think that it would work to create like a club culture code or something, which you can maybe, of course, it's then also just a plaster on the wall, but the reason why I think in Amsterdam that I sometimes read or respect these kinds of posters is also because sometimes there's maybe a poster saying it's a red alert and it says this drugs is filled with something you will die from. Mm-hmm. Because of course, in Amsterdam you have pill and drugs testing, not inside festivals, but during the day. We all focus on education and on harm reduction. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of human behavior also is like if people respect you have the responsibility, or you get recognition for what you do. You maybe try to behave better. Definitely also sexual harassment is a problem also in Amsterdam. But that's why I wanted to ask you, do you think would be like, do we need to have like a code of conduct where we say it's fucking not normal to follow a girl around or follow a guy around when you're really hot for, like 4.5 an hour. That is not normal, and we need to like not self-organize but self-regulate. Sorry. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so code of conducts are great. Places are implementing them. They're popping up all over. But I feel like, again, I mean, there are laws against sexual assault is still illegal, but it happens, right? So if we were to use your harm reduction analogy to this, so the philosophy of harm reduction recognizes much more than saying like, don't do drugs in this venue. Harm reduction is like, okay, let's have a conversation about the different socioeconomic, social justice things that tie to using drugs. Let's talk about different ways to do drugs. Let's talk about why you're using drugs. If we were to apply that to sexual misconduct, it goes further than, oh, what? Like, you violated the code of conduct, you're out into the street. Now, that doesn't change any culture. That person is going to go to wherever. So framing it as like, okay, you know what? To have people in the venue, particularly masculine people in the venue, if we're talking about toxic masculinity, to be like, hey, you know what? Let's maybe talk about other ways to approach people you're interested in and model better behavior rather than using more male aggression to combat male aggression. Doesn't really solve anything. There are places with code of conduct up right now where I have been in line and been asked who I did a sexual favor with to get on the guest list. And so it's like, who is this code of conduct for? Is it just for optics right now? I feel like it is, because there isn't that follow through.
Well, everything starts somewhere. So it needs to be work done. But it's some of it's where it starts with the conversation. Who's next? Gentleman in the front has been patiently waiting, and then one here.
Hey, loving the conversation so far, but we've been talking a lot about nightclubs and places where you can dance and party, but I feel like one of the cool things about a 24/7 city, a sleepless city, is that there's other things to do. And I'm going to use if we're talking about giving shout outs to people of color and to different communities, let's use Richmond in our own, Metro Vancouver context. Richmond has this wonderful road called Alexander Road. And on that road are many eateries that are open till 3 or 4 a.m. and are actual restaurants, not like just some shitty pizza that you get.
Restaurants.
Like actual restaurants run by families who are, serving people till the wee hours of the night. And I feel like that's where people can meet and chill and hang out, whether it's before a club or after a club. I'm wondering, Mirik, if you can tell us, what did you do to rally those kind of folks? The people that want to set up a shop that goes till 4 a.m. serving food, or open air markets for that matter when it's nice weather in the summertime. That like in Taiwan, they have friggin' night markets going till 1 a.m. on the regular every day. But I think those are great places to hang out. You see everybody of all ages hanging out till the night. Like the night doesn't have to just be about young people partying and dancing. It could be so much more. So I want to ask you, where does that rallying start, and how do we make this, go further?
Thank you. Great question.
Oh, who are you, bro?
My name is Rohit, and I'm a local journalist.
And Rohit, we had a poll going on our Instagram stories. He was filmed in a dance competition with the Good Night Out Street team during the Junos this week, and he was the winner.
So I think what you're referring to is happening the most in in Asia, Tokyo. It's like famous for a 24-hour culture. To speak about Amsterdam, we're not there yet.
Not there yet either. Okay.
No. So,
or what are you doing to try and get there? Because I'm assuming you're trying to sell that, right?
Let me respond. No, because that is where also culture is born. I once heard a story about. Do you have Deliveroo here as well? Deliveroo, like Uber Eats type of thing.
Oh.
Deliveroo.
Yeah.
This guy did a sales pitch on stage saying you know how much money I can bring you because with Deliveroo or Uber Eats, I could take away the kitchen out of your house and think about the amount of square meters that is, how much money that would bring to you. And I was in the crowd, I was like, really? Taking the kitchen your kitchen out of your house is like a good idea? This is your sales pitch? Because the kitchen is the place where a culture is being handed down. So yes, I love. That would make me think about Asian cities. And so let's not take away kitchens instead of Deliveroo.
No.
Anyway,
keep kitchens alive.
So no, food is everything. Yeah. So in Amsterdam, the 24-hour license create small little pockets of 24-hour economic system. Because in Asia, the cities like Tokyo, 11 million, metropolitan area, 33 million. That's where you need to have mobility, and you need to have a big bunch of people to create a vibrant 24-hour city. That is two things. So in Amsterdam, we are not that big, of course, so we need little pockets of it. And when you have a 24-hour club, my vision is, that's not the case at this moment, is then maybe next door, a little coffee joint can open, or a little restaurant can open, because nightlife is it's a starting point. It helps to develop these areas, because you're not going to get a 24-hour coffee shop straight away. You first need some activity in the area to build that. In last February, I organized a yearly event where you can enter all the nightclubs in Amsterdam with one ticket, and €1 from every ticket that is bought that night, apart from the festival tickets, is donated to our foundation. And this year we added a night dinner, so more or less 10 of my most favorite restaurants. They opened up for a night dinner, so fine dining after midnight, because of course a festival is always really good to use as a vehicle to get a message across. So not in a big manner, but at least now once a year you can have food after midnight, and I hope they will do it as well at ADE, this big festival. We don't have the Olympic Games, but fine dining after midnight is something which I think is really valuable and can really add to the culture of the city.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that one thing to also remember is that when we're having these conversations, I think that the nightclub community is always very galvanized, because we're young, and this is kind of what we've thrown our lives behind, this music. But I think that Mirik always talks about what the nightmare is all about is everything that happens in a city after dark. I think it's very important to have that holistic kind of view of nightlife. Nightlife is restaurants that are open late. Nightlife is there's a Turkish coffee shop in LA that's open almost 24 hours with these older guys playing chess till all hours. That's nightlife. It's everything. It's activating public spaces like parks after dark on some nights. It's activating museums after dark on some nights. You know, it's not one dimensional. It's a holistic thing, and it's whatever you can do to spark culture. I think that's what nightlife is. So
Yes.
We have time for 2 more questions and then closing remarks.
Hi guys, thanks for putting this on. It's really cool of you. My name is Connor. I am a DJ, producer, and event creator. I do blacklight parties. They're really fun. I do all that underneath the moniker of Nicolo. And I actually just bought SkytrainTill5.com and .ca. So if the city wants something and the people want something, like TransLink doesn't stand a chance. So I want to know which of you guys want to work with me on doing this.
Yes.
And also, I got a lot of shit on my plate. If you just want the domain, you can just have it. So who's up for it?
You can give it to me. I'll make it pretty viral.
Great. Thank you.
Okay. That's awesome. One last question and then closing remarks. So, there's 2. So why don't we just do you 2 in the same row?
Cool.
And then we'll.
Okay. Hi.
Okay. 3. So 3 last questions we'll do, and then okay.
Thank you for making me one of the last questions. So you brought up something that just like really sparked something in me. You talk about how like we keep creating these amazing, thriving communities, especially out of things that are just maybe like run down or kind of nothing neighborhoods to start, and turning them into those rich like cultural places that eventually become the hot and expensive things. And it's like even if we find the new places, whether it's New West or Richmond or wherever it is, like how do we stop the problem from creating itself? Because the problem isn't necessarily the space. Like how do we build the solution in to the future of what these spaces look like, and into the future of the people, the generations of the creatives who are driving that factor? Solve the actual problem, not just the symptom of it.
Great question.
Yeah, I think that the only real actual kind of ammunition you have in that situation is, and it's not an easy answer, but it's get money together, and buy the real estate before you add value to it. And unfortunately, that's the only answer to that question. And you know, it comes from a lot of like, you know, hard lessons from a lot of people who have developed neighborhoods and who have developed areas, and that's what I always hear from those people. Like, I wish I bought that with my friends when we had the DIY space, because it was cheap as hell. And you know, it requires a lot to do that, and it's not always like a realistic answer, but that's like as best as you're gonna get, I think, to really remain a stakeholder in that place that you created.
So I mean, sure, and I just want to say one thing, and then you can. So, like a city like New York or Berlin, they have a culture of philanthropy around culture. We need to have a culture of philanthropy around culture. We don't have that currently. We have a few very brave people who are philanthropists around culture. Then we have a lot of billionaires who don't give anything to culture. So we need to really create that culture of philanthropy around culture, because with that, a lot of the things that you see in a lot of these cities are able to happen because people say, yeah, you can have this building. We don't really have that here right now. We got a lot of people with a lot of buildings, but we don't see that yet. And Rose?
I mean, we're kind of at an advantage in Canada because there are systems in place as far as funding the arts goes. You know, there's the Canada Council, there's BC Music, and I feel like there can be some different ways of working those relationships. I think another way that you can do it essentially is if the city or the province or whoever can mandate that there's a certain amount of land or buildings or whatever that are devoted to culture, and therefore taking artists out of that cycle of gentrification, right? So if they don't have to, because essentially even if they buy the building, that cycle of gentrification is still happening, right?
And once everyone else in the community can't, oh sorry, that's me again. Like, and then once
I didn't even know you saw it on microphone.
Because let's say you buy the building and then the rest of the neighborhood gets gentrified,
Exactly.
They move out. There's no one to go to that building, so it doesn't even matter at that point if you own it.
Yeah, so essentially if there was designated cultural zones that we knew that the zoning wouldn't get changed, for instance, because that's something that we're really facing right now. is that the zoning gets changed and then all of a sudden the land's worth way more money because it can have condos built on it or whatever. So there are certain steps I think that can be taken on behalf of local and provincial government.
And I can say, breaking news to some extent, I received an email from Heather Deal saying that, who's one of the counselors, that there's a large discussion about cultural zones currently. It's something that is really something that they recognize as needed. Where those cultural zones go, that I do not know. But it is absolutely something at the forefront of the conversation. I think something that we're going to be really progressive in pushing forward. So there was 2 more questions, I think.
And then
there and there. And sorry, if you have a question, we'll be hanging out after, so you can ask after at the bar.
And of course, what's also important is who's going to join the think tank for Vancouver.
Hi. Sorry. So actually the answers to the previous question kind of partially answered what I wanted to ask, but it was around how can we build meaningful wealth for arts and culture in Vancouver? Because sure, you can go and support an event by attending it, but so I just started working with the Vancouver Foundation, and so we create endowment funds for nonprofits or for charities specifically. So that's been a new idea that's come in my head. You did talk about building a culture of philanthropy. I think that's something that I want to hear more about.
Yeah, sure. I'd love to talk a little bit more about that. So, in the city of New York, in the meatpacking district, which, has seen itself gentrified crazily over the last 30 years, even in that situation, Michael Bloomberg, who's the former mayor and a billionaire, just like some of our billionaire friends here, just put $80 million down on a new performance arts center, okay? In Chicago, when the Art Institute of Chicago goes through a advancement on one of its buildings, okay? So just an extra part. They privately raise $500 million locally before they go public with asking other people for money. In the city of Vancouver, when we want to have a new art gallery, because our old art gallery is like an old law court, it's not even a proper building for art to be stored in, never mind shown, quite literally, they can privately raise $20 million before they go public with it. And there's this is not a culture of philanthropy around culture. I would say that there's a number of people who have been doing it. There's, there are certain people who have done very well in the community, who have very interesting art galleries and support the arts, and there's some that do not, and they need to. And in some of those cases, what really irritates me about it, and the biggest reason they should, is because they've used the culture of Vancouver for their products that have made them billions of dollars, whether that's in real estate or apparel. And if you are using the culture of Vancouver, then at some point, you need to recognize that and actually support the real culture of Vancouver that you use to literally make billions of dollars. Instead of just buying up buildings, you should give some of them to the community. Because as you know, as someone who works in the charitable sector, you can get a write-off at any building you gift. And so, there's a lot of opportunity. It just takes the courage of those people to start stepping forward. So that's my answer to it.
We have one last one, and then we'll do closing remarks.
Hi, my name is Alice. My question is actually for the Nightmare of Amsterdam. I go to a lot of different types of events, from DJ shows to dancing to opera to ballet, and I feel like there's a huge divide in terms of the audience who attends these. And when I go to opera or ballet, I see really old people, and I'm always the youngest person. So I'm always afraid, what happens when they stop coming? What's going to happen to the arts community that are performing and putting it on? How does Amsterdam keep it live and keep it vibrant, and put on shows for people older than 30?
It's actually pretty funny that you bring this up, because I just recently had a little fight in the media in Amsterdam about, I think if we would get only 1 or maybe 10% of the money that goes to culture with a capital C, I think we would create a much more socially diverse and inclusive city. Because what you are saying, ballet and opera in Amsterdam, it's not diverse. You know, and they're also all above 40 or 30. But the only thing, what I think, what is a nice event in Amsterdam, what happens is we have museum night. Museum night has 50 art institutions that open. It attracts by almost like 30,000 people, and they all stay open till 2 a.m. And then after that there are all after parties all around the city, and you can go back to these venues afterwards. That is one. But I think the other solution is, and that you probably also have this here as well, with art institutions starting up a members club for people below 30 years old. That's how we deal with it. I think. Now, what I actually want to say is that the reason to deal with this problem is that art institutions and definitely museums, they need to get out of their white boxes more and work together. For example, with nightclubs, but can be any other social space, and work together and bring the art outside of the museum so that eventually they will also go back when they're older. Sorry.
So one last question for Mirik. So on that, during your presentation, you showed all those cities, you know, the different cities. So how does Vancouver become one of those cities?
It's by creating here tonight a think tank of 10 people that want to continue this conversation, because now I think it was a really interesting conversation, but I can also imagine that the people in the room would say, okay, that's great evening, great talk, but what is the next step? Mm-hmm. And I think the next step is creating like a think tank or something, maybe try to draw up like a white paper or manifesto, because don't wait for the city to install a night mayor, nighttime commission, whatever. Organize yourself. Get self-organized. Try to make it as diverse and inclusive if you can, and work from there, because having a nightlife officer or a night mayor doesn't release you of the fact of the obligation to come up with your own vision and try to influence decision making.
Awesome. Well, I want to thank you, Mirik. I want to thank our panelists, and I want to thank our audience for a wonderful discussion tonight.